These things are really, really awesome. Today on the Cool Stuff Guys Like channel, I've got some really exciting stuff. As you can see, I've got a few chainsaws in front of me here, and what I'm going to talk about is what I would call the 5 stages of chainsaw modification. Now, starting with something like a stage 1 modification, this would be a saw that you could use every day. There's really no real changes to reliability. You just might get a little bit more power out of the saw, all the way to what I would call a stage 5, where it's a full-blown race saw that could, just annihilate, but might not exactly be something you're ever going to be able to take into the woods with you. So let's get started. So let's start with our stage 1 modified chainsaw. In front of me I've got a Husqvarna 346 XP. And this one is a really good runner. It's honestly, even in stock configuration, it's a pretty nice little saw. It's about 50 cc's, or it is actually 50 cc's. And it spins some pretty screaming RPMs. This thing will cut probably 10,500 RPMs in the cut, and with stage 1, as we call it, push that up to maybe 11,000 RPMs. So what I would call stage 1 is simply a muffler mod and a squish band optimization. So the muffler mod, all you're really going to do is, or at least all I would normally do, is look at the opening of the muffler on the saw. So you'll take the muffler off and just open it up a little bit. You don't have to get crazy with this. You can actually get too crazy. It's not like one of those things where more is always better. I'll open it up with a carbide burr on a Dremel tool and open it up to, say, 1.5 times what it was from the factory. Some people will take it a step further. They'll drill out a hole and they'll braze on some little ports with tubing. You could use something like metal electrical conduit as your tubing. But what this does is it really allows the saw to breathe a lot better. A lot of these saws come pretty restricted from the factory. It makes them a little bit quieter, makes them sip fuel a little bit more, but you might want to unlock that power at the expense of a little bit of noise. So, and honestly, if you're going to modify it the way I did, the amount of extra noise we're talking about is really not that much. It's maybe, 25% louder with a little bit more of a just kind of throaty, mean kind of sound to it. The second part of this modification is the squish band. So if you look inside one of these cylinders, you'll see at the top there's usually kind of a flat ring. And when the piston comes up nice and close to that ring, from the factory they're going to leave that kind of a generous gap there. It might be 35 thousandths of an inch or 40 thousandths of an inch. Well, you can usually take that gap down. What that's going to do is it's going to lower your intake port where the air comes in. It's going to lower your exhaust port where the air where the exhaust goes out. It's going to give the saw a little bit more grunt, and it's also going to increase the compression by reducing the volume of that combustion chamber. So you're compressing the same amount of air and fuel into a smaller space. So that's where you get that increase in compression. So the numbers you want to look for your squish band are usually in the 16 thousandths of an inch to, say, 22 thousandths of an inch. And the way you're going to measure that is just simply with a piece of electrical solder, as close a size as you can get to the number you're expecting to be measuring. If you don't have a piece that's really close, pound it down so that it is close. You don't want to be smashing anything too hard in these engines. And see where it's at with no base gasket. And from there you can decide, can you get away with no base gasket, which is going to reduce your squish, or do you need to make a custom base gasket? What I end up having to do on almost all these saws is what I call a beer can base gasket. So basically you cut a gasket out of an aluminum soda or beer can, and you end up with about a 5 thousandths of an inch gasket, which Works pretty well. I'll use a little bit of Permatex Moto Seal on the gasket, and I haven't had any trouble with these things leaking. So the pros and cons of your stage 1 build, I mean, it's going to be almost free. It doesn't really cost you any money to do this. Some people claim that with a modded muffler, the saw will run cooler. My guess is it's probably kind of a wash because you are exhausting that burnt mix out easier, but you're also making a little bit more power. So more power equals more heat, but you're exhausting it out. So I'd call that a wash. And I mean, otherwise I don't see much of any disadvantage. If you live somewhere where spark arresters are required though, so if you're somewhere prone to wildfires, of course, just make sure however you choose to mod the muffler, you do put some sort of spark arrestor on it. I will note, if you're going to do these mods too, you're always going to want to retune the carburetor. So you're going to want to adjust that high and low screw and sometimes the idle adjustment to make sure that that saw is running rich enough in the cut. So basically what you're looking for is at full throttle. You don't want that thing just screaming. You want it to kind of almost sound like it's hitting a rev limiter. They call it 4-stroking. When you hit that, when you free rev it, basically. So maybe one con is you are going to probably use a little bit more fuel, but is it really more fuel per cut? I don't know, because you're cutting a little bit faster. So I honestly think that's kind of a wash. And that's pretty much it. And the kind of power you can expect from this stage 1 muffler mod squish modification is usually in the 10 to 15% more power range, and that is definitely noticeable in the saw. You're going to see snappier throttle response, and you're going to see some improved cut times in the wood. So now you've done this, now you're thinking, what else can I get out of this saw for little expense and maybe a little bit of labor? What I would call stage 2, that's going to be your porting. And with the porting, I'll often do timing advances as well. So let's talk about how you would do that. These things are usually ported from the factory for certain characteristics. They don't want to burn a lot of fuel. They want to make sure that they don't get too hot. They want to make sure they start nice and easy. And they also want to make sure that they're really forgiving on a tune, so they're not constantly needing adjustment. But what you can do, if you're willing to give up some of that stuff, is port it. So the exhaust port on a 2-stroke, it's in the side of the cylinder, not on the top like a 4-stroke. You can usually raise that a little bit. And by raising that, it really helps those exhaust gases escape, and it helps the air-fuel charge coming up through the transfer ports push in there and even blow a little bit out the exhaust, but you want to make sure you get that good charge in there. So you can raise that a little bit, and you can also widen it a little bit. If you're going to do this though, I will note, you can certainly make your saw run worse if you're not careful, so make sure you research your saw like crazy and make sure that you, if you can find numbers that people have had success with, use their port numbers. And the way to figure out your port timing numbers is with this. Let me go grab something. So this is a degree wheel. I put a drill chuck on it, so I can mount this on top of the flywheel of the engine, and then I can figure out where bottom dead center is. So what I'll do is I'll put a piston stop in the spark plug hole, and I'll go stop to stop, and then I'll find the halfway point between that. So that is bottom dead center. So I'll zero my gauge so that basically it's reading the same positive number as it is reading the same negative number on each side of that turn. So we're basically centered on bottom dead center. And then from there, you can record when each port opens and closes and chase those numbers that you're looking for. I mentioned you can raise the exhaust port, you can widen the exhaust port. You don't want to raise it too much because you'll lose a little bit of torque. You'll gain a little RPM, you'll lose a little torque. You don't want to widen it too much because then you'll get too close to the piston skirt, the edge of the piston. So that can cause, well, you can imagine the problems that's going to cause. You don't want any sort of leakage happening around the piston skirt where you're leaking that air fuel charge out of the crankcase. Then you can do, on the intake side, often you can lower the intake a little bit, so that increases the intake duration. You have a little bit more time where that air fuel is coming in. You can play with the transfer ports, but that's where things get a little bit tricky. Not all saws behave the same to transfer port modifications. Some like them raised, some like them lowered. Some saws want a nice big generous radius on the bottom of the transfer ports, but then you're giving up crankcase, you're creating crankcase volumes. You're not jamming that air fuel up in there like you might otherwise be. So that gets a little tricky, but another thing that these saws almost universally like is polish on the exhaust port. So you can polish the exhaust port, let that exhaust kind of flow out of there a little bit better. But don't polish the intake port. The intake port, if you imagine something polished with wet fuel on it, it could bead up. You don't really want that. You kind of want a little bit of a rougher surface on the intake. So I mentioned a timing advance as the second part of this stage 2 modification. So the way you're going to advance the timing on these saws is simple. You're basically going to take off the flywheel, which also has the magnets for the ignition, and then file the key. There's a key usually on that flywheel. Sometimes it's attached to the flywheel permanently, sometimes it's a separate key. But basically, you're going to file that key in such a way that you can turn that flywheel clockwise and then tighten it. So every degree that you can turn it is 1 degree of timing advance. And these saws I'll generally advance anywhere from maybe 3 to 6 degrees. And that's going to allow that ignition to spark earlier. So when that piston's coming up, it's going to spark a little bit earlier and build a little bit more pressure in the cylinder when it hits that peak combustion. Now the risk of this is going to be you can cause detonation. You might end up having to run a little bit higher octane fuel if you advance it a little bit too far. My craziest saws you'll see here, I'll run a blend of racing gas and pump gas, but it's still nothing that crazy. I'm only running 95 octane, even in the craziest saws you're going to see here today, but we'll get to that later. So advantages, disadvantages. Obvious advantage is more power. A ported saw is going to really wake that saw up. It's going to basically punch at least 1 saw class above. So you have a 60cc saw, it'll keep up with like a 70cc, maybe with some aggressive porting, maybe even keep up with an 80cc saw. It can be basically free. You can do this again with a Dremel if you wanted. I like to use a Fordham rotary tool. It's just got a lot more torque, and you're going to use a series of carbide burrs to basically grind on these things. It's not something that you're probably going to be an expert at overnight. The people that are good at this have done dozens or hundreds of saws, but just don't do it on a saw that you think is like really nice saw as your first one. Maybe try it on a saw that isn't really worth much first. The disadvantages, there's no going back. So if you port it and you accidentally take it a little too far, where maybe you're not actually making the power you want, you're actually starting to lose power, the only way to basically reverse it is to start with a fresh new cylinder. So another thing you could do is, instead of porting your Husqvarna cylinder, maybe you could actually instead choose to port like an aftermarket cylinder and then keep your OEM cylinder the same. So here's a saw. This is what I would call a stage 2. This is a Husqvarna 257, which I've converted to a 262 XP. And it's ported, it's got a timing advance, it's got a muffler mod, and that saw cuts about 30 or 40% faster than stock. It's a pretty noticeable upgrade. I mean, it's basically an entirely different saw altogether. So that's the kind of gains you could kind of expect here. I would say somewhere around the area of 30 to 40% more power. Maybe if your saw was a little tame from the start, maybe even a little bit more. Or maybe if you're going to be just spot on with those porting numbers, maybe a little bit more. So let's move on to stage 3. Now is where maybe the trade-offs are starting to be a little bit more substantial. And this one's going to be pretty simple, but you'll see where I'm kind of going with this. So stage 3 is going to be, now you've got your muffler mod, your ported, your timing advance. So that saw can breathe a little bit better. So now where is the bottleneck in the system? Usually it's going to be the carburetor. So on a ported saw, what I can then do is put a bigger carburetor. This saw here, this is another modified 261. It would normally come with an HDA 144 carburetor. I put an HDA 87 carburetor on it. So that takes the carburetor opening, the smallest point, the venturi. It takes it from about 15 millimeters to something like 16.5. So that's a pretty substantial increase. And what's obviously going to happen with an increase like that is you're going to get more power, especially at high RPMs, which this saw, which we'll get to later, loves. But the trade-off is, with a larger hole in the carburetor, the problem is you're not creating as strong of a vacuum or as strong of a flow. So that venturi effect, where you're sucking that fuel up in, is going to be a little bit weaker. So it's going to struggle to atomize fuel at low RPMs, which is going to make the saw a little bit harder to start. It can make it a little bit harder to get a good, clean idle out of the saw. Sometimes the idle will kind of change when the saw is cold versus hot, and you're kind of tweaking it a little bit here and there to get everything right. Something you're going to want to do once you get to this level of modification is, what's going to happen is your saw is going to start cutting so fast that the oiler isn't going to probably keep up with how fast that chain is basically building friction from just moving chips like crazy. So what you end up having to do is modify your oiler. So these oilers have a gear that rides on a little kind of cam and cam follower kind of thing, like a little slant at the end. And what you can do is increase the angle on, let me sort of put my hand right here, increase the angle on the end where that little follower rides, which causes a little piston in that oil pump to push in and out a little bit further, create a little bit more oil flow, so you can keep that chain from overheating when you're starting to make some pretty serious power. So what kind of pros and cons? I kind of mentioned the cons of it. The pros are definitely, you thought you were getting to the edge of what you could do with a ported saw. This pretty much fully optimizes that ported saw and gives you that air that saw really wants. It gives you that extra kind of 10, maybe 15% more power. Again, it kind of all comes down to how undersized was your stock carburetor. You kind of want the right size carburetor. You don't necessarily want bigger than what the cylinder can take in. This isn't necessarily a cheap modification either. It's not like they just offer aftermarket larger carburetors for these saws. You're usually going to find one from another saw, and any OEM parts are usually big money. You could easily pay $100+ for a used carburetor, and you may end up having to do some work to it, even maybe some machining to make that carburetor fit. Luckily on this saw, the HDA 87 is basically a direct fit for the HDA 144 and the HDA 120, except that they are like really, really hard to find. At any given time, there's usually 0 of these things for sale, so you have to kind of hunt them down, start asking around in the forums if anybody has one of these things, which is exactly what I did to find the carburetor that I have. So everything I've talked about up to this point has been pretty reasonable to do. You could bring these saws out and nobody would really notice anything too crazy about them. You could use it in the woods probably just about all day, every day, and as long as you keep it tuned well, you keep it so that it's doing that little bit of four-stroking when you free rev it, it's probably going to be a pretty hassle-free saw for you, with maybe the exception of the bigger carburetor. Going to be tweaking the screws on that carburetor a little bit more, but otherwise hassle-free, usable, everyday saw. But what I'm going to get into now is, let's call that maybe a little bit of a different story. This is everything I've said up until now, and then adding a tuned pipe to the saw. So you're thinking, what's really the difference between a tuned pipe and a muffler mod? Well, there's a massive, massive difference between the two. These two saws here have a tuned pipe, or what you call an expansion chamber. And this is something that people started doing probably in the 60s and 70s to two-strokes, especially racing two-strokes. So they'd put these big, kind of silly-looking pipes on them. And the reason why is you have this big, big pressure wave coming out of there when that combustion happens. So as soon as that pressure escapes that exhaust port, you've got this massive sound wave, and somebody realized you could actually channel that sound wave to your advantage. So these pipes are tuned to work with that sound wave. The first cone you see here, the diffuser cone, when the sound wave expands, or that pressure wave expands, it will send an equal and opposite wave back. It will reflect it back. So what that equal and opposite wave does, if it hits that port at the exact right time, is it will suck the air-fuel mix into that cylinder. So in that respect, it's acting similar to maybe like what a supercharger is doing, but it doesn't end there. So now it's blasted that air-fuel mix in, but it can't really build pressure because the exhaust port is still wide open. So that sound wave continues to travel down, and it hits this second cone. Sometimes it's called a baffle, and it reflects that sound wave back at the cylinder. So then at the exact right time, right before that port closes, you jam that air-fuel mix back in there that all kind of shot out the exhaust. You jam it in, and that's where you really get that supercharger effect. So people will look at these and think you're just some kind of show-off, that you think you want some flashy big pipe on the saw. If I could make this kind of power with a much smaller pipe, I certainly would love to. But the reality of it is, you need these dimensions to make this kind of power. You need this tuned length. You need to work with the speed of sound at exhaust temperatures, which works out to about 1,700 feet per second. So when you work the numbers on 1,700 feet per second at 11,000 RPMs, which is where we're going to want to tune the pipe to on a saw like this one in particular, and then you figure the exhaust port is open for something like 35 to 40% of one revolution. When you work those numbers, you come up with something like 20 to 22 inches as the tuned length where you want this second wave to reflect back in, because you have to go both directions, remember, with this sound wave. So these things are really, really awesome. These things wake up the saw like nothing else. It makes the saw sound exactly like a dirt bike. It's why every dirt bike you see has an expansion chamber. The reason you don't see it on a chainsaw, maybe it's obvious, but you know, it's not exactly as usable when you have a big expansion chamber on here. When you try to cut off a stump close to the ground, you're kind of limited. Of course, it's a little harder to kind of get the saw around. It's a little harder to fill it with gas and oil because you can't set the saw on its side anymore. So there's some obvious drawbacks to having an expansion chamber on the saw, but the power is insane. I would say when you get to this, what I call stage 4, you're giving up a lot. You can't really use the chainsaw as your everyday chainsaw. It's more of like a novelty or a racing chainsaw. So you can get it out to kind of show off to your friends or whatever. You can bring it to a race if the race allows tuned pipes like this. But I mean, a lot of people are going to think this is really, really awesome, including myself. The cons, though, a lot of people are going to hate it. A lot of people are going to think this is the dumbest thing they've ever seen because they usually don't really understand the dynamics of a pipe like this, or they don't understand why anyone would want to even modify something that they consider a utility tool. You know, it's getting to the point where there's enough horsepower now that you might start to break parts. And once you get to that point, it's kind of a chain reaction of you kind of modifying one thing after another to make the saw kind of survive. But I don't know. If you have a lot of saws laying around, I would certainly think about doing something like this to one of them as your kind of firewood ripper saw that just cooks through firewood. So this kind of modification is not unrealistic to see 80 or 90% increases over stock. This saw almost cuts twice as fast as the stock saw. It just screams. It's a really, really, really awesome saw to run. And the stock 261, if you've ever run it, is also a pretty nice saw to run. I don't think people have a lot of complaints about that saw. So that's that. Now let's talk about stage 5. When you get into stage 5, this is going to be race only, short bursts only, and that's going to be when you get into, it's going to be exotic fuels. So if you look at like a top fuel dragster, they're all running nitromethane. What you'll see some people do with chainsaws is they will run either some blend of methanol and nitro, or they'll run like remote control car fuel, like Traxxas RC fuel, which is methanol, nitro, and make silly, crazy power out of these chainsaws. But that comes at a massive, massive cost. So the stoichiometric ratio for gasoline is 14.7 to 1. So that means you need 14.7 parts air to 1 part gas to have optimal combustion. Well, the stoichiometric ratio of nitro is 1.7 to 1. So you can't have a saw that runs nitro well and runs gas, frankly, at all. You really need to have, it's really a purpose-built machine that is going to run, 5+ times the fuel, depending on how much nitro methanol blend you have here, just to even be optimized. This means you might have a fuel pump on it, like a real fuel pump, not like the little pump that's in your carburetor that's impulse powered. You're going to have way bigger jets in the carburetor, and it's not going to start or run well, like, at all. Even when you get into the race gas, like I ran a VP 110 race gas in this saw, just not because I wanted to make more power, because I was starting to get a little nervous, especially when I first started it up, that I would cause detonation. But even when you get into race gas, it doesn't ignite nearly as easy as pump gas does. And you get into methanol, and you usually have to use a different fuel to start the engine. So I don't even think I need to go into what the cons of that are. I mean, one obviously being that you're probably going to break a lot of parts and you're going to be constantly fixing things. Two being it's like very not easy to use the saw. It's like a whole process of getting the thing started now. But the obvious pro here is the amount of power that you can make with these fuels is unreal. It's insane. You could make 3-4 times the horsepower, and that's even with a pretty diluted blend that you're running. You think about a 500 cubic inch top fuel dragster making 8,000 or 9,000 horsepower. It's the kind of fuel that you can, or the kind of power that you can make with these fuels. So let's talk about what I've mentioned, kind of what I call stage 1 through stage 5. What stages would I recommend? With a disclaimer that it's your saw. Anything can go wrong here. Obviously, the muffler mod. Everyone who can turn a wrench might consider doing a muffler mod to their saws. If it's not like a collectible chainsaw, that is. The muffler mod and the porting, that's kind of where I land as like the everyday saw at stage 1, stage 2, kind of being where you want to land with these things. When you get into even the bigger carburetor, the saw starts to become just a little more finicky, a little more hassle for marginal gains. And then when you get into the pipes, if you have enough saws that you can dedicate a saw to be a pipe saw, well, that's really, really fun. All of a sudden, it's not even a tool anymore. It's like a toy that's really fun to use. But if it's your only saw, like, this is kind of silly to put a pipe on it like this. Now, I'd love to hear from you guys if there are some modifications that I missed here, especially because, as you can see, a couple of these saws are pure race toy saws. So I'm willing to take some risks and give up some creature comforts if I can make these saws even a little bit more rowdy. If you want to learn more about any of these saws, let me know. Maybe I'll make some future videos about these things. And if you haven't already subscribed, make sure to subscribe and like below if you like this video. Thanks for watching.